The sound of the kettle boiling was the loudest thing in the flat. Charlotte Ashford stood by the window of their second-floor home in Notting Hill, fingers wrapped loosely around her teacup. The morning was soft, painted in greys and creams, and the street below was still slick with dew. Her husband, James, had left early, again. He was rarely home past 8, though she stopped checking the clock long ago. He was always working, always somewhere else, wrapped up in negotiations or receptions that rarely included her. Lucy, their 10-year-old daughter, sat at the table behind her, drawing birds in a battered sketchbook. Her hair was tucked messily behind one ear, her feet swinging slightly as she hummed a tune under her breath. The soft pencil strokes were the only other sound. "Did you eat your toast, darling?" Charlotte asked gently. "Only half," Lucy murmured. It was cold. Charlotte turned back toward the window, her thoughts trailing into silence again. It had been months since they had laughed at dinner. Months since James had touched her arm without brushing past. Yet Charlotte had trained herself to remain composed. She had her routines, her daughter, and her pride. Then came the knock. It was light, uncertain. When Charlotte opened the door, she found a young woman with wide eyes and auburn hair pulled into a messy bun. A rucksack hung over one shoulder, and her cheeks were flushed. "I'm so sorry to bother you," she said. "I'm Eleanor. I've just moved into the top flat. I think I got your parcel by mistake." Charlotte accepted the small package and offered a polite smile. "No trouble at all. Welcome." Eleanor lingered for a moment. "I'm doing my post-grad placement at the embassy, actually. Under Mr. Ashford." Charlotte's smile barely flickered. "Oh. James never mentioned you." The young woman tilted her head, uncertain. "He said he lives downstairs with his wife and daughter. It's a beautiful building. I hope I'm not being intrusive." "Not at all," Charlotte replied, a little more firmly. "Have a good day." As the door clicked shut, Charlotte's hand rested on the brass handle. So this was Eleanor Brooks. Later that evening, as James returned home, his voice traveled lightly through the flat, unusually warm. "You met Eleanor, didn't you?" Charlotte didn't look up from her book. "Briefly. She seems eager." "She's sharp," James said, removing his coat. "Very driven. Reminds me of someone." The words hung in the air like dust motes in fading light. That night, Charlotte watched him across the dinner table. His shoulders were relaxed in a way she hadn't seen in years. She watched how he looked at his phone between bites, how his lips curved, not in a smile, but a memory. She didn't say a word. But something had shifted. And the walls, for the first time, felt less like shelter and more like waiting rooms for truths that hadn't yet arrived. It started with tremors, subtle, barely perceptible. Charlotte noticed it while reaching for the sugar jar. A vibration ran along the countertop, so slight she thought it might have been the underground. But then Lucy's glass toppled over, spilling orange juice across her sketchbook. "Mummy!" Lucy blinked up at her, startled. "It's all right, darling," Charlotte said, wiping the table. "Might just be trains passing too close." But it wasn't. The earth beneath Notting Hill had begun to stir. Later that day, James returned from work unusually early. His face was drawn, his tie loosened. He poured himself a whiskey without a word and collapsed onto the armchair. "Long day?" Charlotte asked, folding laundry across the back of the sofa. "Evacuation drills. Building codes. Everyone's on edge," he muttered. "Apparently the embassy's structure isn't as secure as they thought." Charlotte tilted her head slightly. "And Eleanor? Is she all right?" James blinked at her, caught off guard. "She's fine. I had her assigned off-site for now." His words settled between them like dust on glass. Charlotte said nothing. That night, Charlotte struggled to sleep. Something about the way James had spoken of Eleanor stayed with her, tucked beneath layers of silence. She turned in bed, staring at the ceiling while James snored softly beside her. Then came the quake. It was sudden, violent, and unkind. At 2:14 in the morning, the floor shuddered beneath them. Books crashed from shelves. Glass shattered in the kitchen. Lucy screamed from her bedroom as the building groaned, old bricks rebelling against years of stillness. Charlotte bolted upright, heart thundering. "Lucy!" She ran to her daughter's room, scooping her into her arms as the walls quaked. James appeared in the hallway, his face pale. "We need to get out." Together, they stumbled toward the front door, until another tremor hit. The stairwell outside cracked, bricks raining down, the groan of steel deep and menacing. "James, the fire exit!" Charlotte shouted. But James was gone. He had turned, bolted up the staircase toward the top floor, toward Eleanor. Charlotte stood frozen, holding Lucy close as dust rained down on their heads. Seconds later, the tremor ceased. The building held, barely. James returned, covered in soot, supporting Eleanor under one arm. Her eyes were wide, tear-streaked, her bare feet cut from running. He didn't look at Charlotte. He didn't say a word. Only when they reached the street did Charlotte see it clearly. James still had his arm around Eleanor. And Lucy, pressed tight to Charlotte's chest, whispered through trembling lips, "He left us, Mummy." Charlotte said nothing. She only watched the cracks form, not just in the pavement, but in everything she thought was solid. The days after the earthquake unfolded like a strange play, each scene more disjointed than the last. The building stood, but it leaned now, ever so slightly, like a tired man trying not to fall. Engineers came and taped off the stairwells. Neighbors whispered in hallways. The community buzzed with repair plans and insurance claims. But in the flat above theirs, Eleanor remained. She had nowhere else to go, apparently. James offered her the guest room temporarily, though Charlotte noted how often Eleanor remained upstairs, in her own damaged flat, and how often James disappeared up there with coffee or sandwiches. Charlotte didn't object. She simply watched. And listened. Through the thin ceiling, she heard laughter. A clink of glasses. Once, music. Low, sultry jazz that never played in their home. James hadn't danced in years, but one night, she saw the outline of his shadow on the upstairs curtain, spinning slowly, as though leading someone by the waist. Lucy noticed it, too. "Why doesn't Daddy help us anymore?" she asked while Charlotte cleaned soot from the walls. Charlotte smiled faintly, brushing ash from her daughter's cheek. "He's just busy, darling." But the word tasted bitter in her mouth. One evening, while James was out buying groceries, Charlotte climbed the stairs. The door to Eleanor's flat was ajar. Inside, it looked nothing like the aftermath of disaster. Candles lit the room, casting soft gold over the cracked walls. The air smelled of lavender and wine. On the table lay a stack of James's diplomatic briefs, his handwriting scribbled in the margins. And a scarf. Charlotte's scarf. Worn loosely over the back of a chair. She turned to leave, but her foot caught something. A sketchbook. She opened it. Pages upon pages of Eleanor's elegant hand-drawn portraits. One of the corner shop. One of the street after the quake. One of James. Smiling. Holding a teacup. Looking younger than Charlotte had seen him in years. She closed the book gently. When James returned that night, Charlotte was reading in bed, glasses perched low on her nose. He kissed her forehead absently, then moved to undress. "You were gone a while," she said, not looking up. "They didn't have Lucy's cereal," he replied. "Had to try 3 places. Millimeter." He paused. "What is it?" Charlotte smiled and turned a page. "Nothing." But when the light went out, and James drifted off beside her, Charlotte lay wide awake, eyes open in the dark. The girl upstairs was no longer a guest. She had become a presence. One that lingered in their walls, on James's collar, in the empty spaces Charlotte used to fill. And Charlotte, as calm as ever, began to plan. Weeks passed. Repairs to the building moved slowly, hindered by bureaucracy and the stubborn nature of old London stone. Cracks remained in the walls, and dust settled like a second skin over everything. Inside their flat, the silence between Charlotte and James grew heavier. They no longer fought. There was no shouting, no slamming doors. Just careful conversation, polite, precise, and utterly hollow. Charlotte spent more time with Lucy. They baked biscuits, walked to the park, and read books under blankets. It was in those quiet moments that Charlotte felt anchored. Lucy's laughter was still genuine, still innocent. It reminded her what mattered. James, meanwhile, vanished into errands, late meetings, and quick chats upstairs. Eleanor had taken a teaching assistant position at James's school. He spoke of it often. How bright she was. How dedicated. How refreshing it was to work with someone so full of promise. Charlotte never responded. She didn't need to. She noticed Eleanor's perfume on their hand towels. Her handwriting in James's planner. Her red umbrella left deliberately in their hallway, as though to say, I was here. One afternoon, Charlotte came home early from the bank. Rain soaked her coat as she entered the lobby. The lift was out of order again, an all too common nuisance since the quake. So she took the stairs. As she approached their door, she heard laughter. James's voice. And Eleanor's. She stopped. Not because they were laughing, but because of how he laughed. It was full. Warm. The kind of laugh he used to save only for Charlotte. She didn't open the door right away. She stood outside, holding her breath, until the laughter faded. When she entered moments later, James was at the sink, rinsing mugs. Eleanor was nowhere to be seen. Oh, he said, startled. Didn't hear you come in. Clearly, she replied, taking off her coat. James turned off the tap, hands dripping. We were just having tea. Charlotte raised a hand. You don't need to explain. I just thought. You thought wrong. She walked past him, toward the hallway. Charlotte. She stopped. Slowly turned to face him. Yes. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Only lowered his eyes. She nodded, satisfied. Later that evening, while Lucy slept and James remained in the study, Charlotte returned to Eleanor's flat. This time, she wasn't curious. She was certain. The key was still under the potted plant. Inside, the flat was quiet. No candles. No music. Just papers. Sketches. A teacup with lipstick on the rim. And something else. A letter. Folded. Addressed to J. She didn't open it. Not yet. She slid it into her coat pocket and left as quietly as she'd come. In her own kitchen, Charlotte boiled the kettle, poured herself a cup of tea, and sat by the window. She looked out at the city lights. At the cracks in the pavement. At the world that had shifted, subtly but irreversibly. Just like her marriage. And as the tea cooled, the letter in her pocket pulsed with unspoken truth. She wouldn't read it tonight. But she would, soon. Not out of jealousy. But clarity. It rained again the next morning. London seemed unable to dry itself lately, as if the skies grieved with Charlotte. Still, she dressed precisely, her coat buttoned to the neck, her hair pinned like always. She made Lucy breakfast, packed her lunch, and sent her off with a soft kiss on the forehead. James was already gone. The letter sat unopened on the kitchen counter. It had shifted in her pocket all night, a weight more psychological than physical. Now, as the flat stood still around her, Charlotte picked it up. She didn't sit down. She unfolded it like a surgeon with a scalpel. The handwriting was unmistakably Eleanor's, sharp, round, too careful to be casual. J. I never meant to be a disruption. I only wanted to be close to someone who made the world feel steady. You do that. With you, I don't feel lost anymore. You said everything changed after the quake. That you couldn't pretend anymore. I believe you. But I need to know, was it real, or just a moment between falling walls? Charlotte stared at the last line. She folded the letter neatly and slid it back into its envelope. Then she opened the cupboard, took out the kitchen lighter, and lit the letter's corner over the sink. It burned slowly. Calmly. She washed away the ashes without ceremony. Her hands trembled only slightly. Later that day, Charlotte visited the school where Eleanor was working. She waited outside the side entrance, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the oak trees swaying in the wind. When Eleanor finally appeared, she looked surprised but not frightened. Mrs. Ashford, she said cautiously, clutching her folder. I didn't expect. Charlotte held up her hand. Don't speak. She stepped closer. The distance between them dissolved. I know everything, she said softly. The laughter. The cups of tea. The letter. The way you make him feel young again. Eleanor opened her mouth, but Charlotte cut her off with a smile. You should know something, Charlotte continued. He used to laugh like that for me. Before the wrinkles. Before diplomacy and distractions. But that was real once. Not a moment between falling walls. It was my life. Eleanor looked down, her throat moving as she swallowed. Charlotte leaned closer. I don't hate you. I don't even pity you. But I do want you to understand, this ends now. Eleanor blinked. He said he was going to tell you. Of course he did. Men always say that. But they rarely do, because they're cowards in fine suits. Charlotte turned to leave. Oh, and Eleanor, she said, pausing on the steps. Yes. Your umbrella. You left it in our hallway. It's in the bin now. She didn't wait for a reply. That evening, when James returned home, Charlotte was in the kitchen, wiping down the counters. The house was warm, dinner already made. He set his briefcase down gently. I saw Eleanor today, he said, cautiously. Charlotte didn't look up. So did I. He exhaled slowly, like he'd been holding his breath all day. I want to fix this, he said. She turned to face him now, drying her hands on a towel. I'm not something broken to be glued back together, James. I'm someone you left on the floor when the walls came down. He swallowed hard, stepping closer. Let me try. You already made your choice. There was no heat in her voice. Just truth. That night, Charlotte moved a suitcase into the guest bedroom. James didn't stop her. The invitation arrived a week later. A diplomatic charity gala at the Royal Exchange, complete with orchestras, speeches, and champagne towers. James was to give a closing address. It was a yearly affair, and this time, spouses were expected. Charlotte hadn't attended the gala in years. Not since Lucy was born. Not since she'd found James whispering too closely to a woman in a silk dress at the 2017 event. Nothing had happened, he'd insisted. But Charlotte had begun staying home, always with polite excuses and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. This year, she said yes. When James returned home that evening and saw the gold-embossed card on the hallway table, he looked up at her. You'll come? Charlotte nodded once. Yes. I will. She watched the surprise flicker in his expression. watched the way he straightened slightly, uncertain. On the night of the gala, Charlotte wore a black velvet gown with long sleeves and a plunging back. Her hair swept into a low twist, lips painted red. She looked like someone entirely new, and entirely herself. James stood beside her in a classic tuxedo, but for once, it was he who looked out of place. At the Royal Exchange, marble columns loomed and chandeliers sparkled. The room buzzed with diplomats, dignitaries, and quiet tension wrapped in velvet. Charlotte moved through the space with poise. She greeted people she hadn't seen in years, shook hands firmly, and never once looked uncertain. James hovered. He introduced her as his wife, and more than one person blinked in surprise. Charlotte, a woman in a navy gown, asked, adjusting her pearls. "Goodness, you haven't changed a bit." Charlotte smiled. "Oh, I have. You just haven't been watching closely enough." Eleanor was there, of course. In a demure ivory dress that clung a bit too tightly. She floated around James like a moth in silk. But tonight, he never strayed far from Charlotte. When the orchestra paused for the speeches, James took the stage. He spoke of unity, of rebuilding after disaster, of finding strength in unexpected places. Charlotte sipped her champagne and didn't clap. Later, in the hall lined with framed portraits, James found her standing alone. "You didn't applaud," he said quietly. "I've heard better speeches," she replied. He exhaled, rubbing his jaw. "I can't undo what I did," he said. "But I want to start again." "I don't want anyone else, Charlotte." "Not her." Charlotte looked at him, her gaze level. "I believe you," she said. James blinked. "But believing you doesn't mean I trust you," she added. "Those are two different things." He reached for her hand, but she stepped back. "Tonight," she said, voice calm, "was my goodbye. You just didn't realize it." She turned and walked into the crowd. The weeks following the gala were a blur for Charlotte. She continued her routine, but something within her had shifted. It was like the ground had moved beneath her feet, and everything she thought she knew was now unsteady. James tried. He really did. He came home early some nights, brought flowers, and even asked about her day, questions that felt rehearsed, like lines from a script. The warmth he once had for her seemed distant, a shadow of what it had been. And she noticed how he started spending more time with Eleanor. It wasn't obvious, just little things at first. Eleanor always seemed to need James for advice, for guidance. It was subtle at first, but Charlotte could see the way his eyes softened when she spoke. The cracks in their marriage, which had been small and easy to ignore before, were now impossible to overlook. One Thursday afternoon, Charlotte was reviewing her notes in the living room when the doorbell rang. She opened it to find Eleanor standing there, her hair slightly windblown, a nervous energy radiating from her. "Is James home?" Eleanor asked quickly, before Charlotte could even offer a greeting. "No, he's still at the office," Charlotte replied, surprised by her own calmness. "Is something wrong?" Eleanor hesitated for a moment, looking down at the ground before meeting Charlotte's eyes. I just needed to talk to him about something. It's personal." Charlotte raised an eyebrow. "Personal?" Eleanor nodded, but then seemed to hesitate. "It's nothing important. Just some work stuff." Charlotte felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name. There had been times when she could ignore Eleanor's presence, but this urgency in her voice, was something else entirely. She stepped aside and gestured for Eleanor to come in. "Well, you can wait for him inside." Eleanor gave a tight-lipped smile and stepped past Charlotte. As they entered the living room, Charlotte noticed the unease in Eleanor's posture, the way she sat stiffly on the edge of the sofa. "I'm sure it's nothing," Eleanor said, though her voice betrayed her uncertainty. "I just didn't want to bother him at work." Charlotte took a deep breath. This wasn't just about the work anymore. There was something more to this, something between James and Eleanor that Charlotte could no longer ignore. The tension in the air was palpable as they sat in silence. Charlotte studied Eleanor closely, her mind racing. Why now? Why this sudden need to talk to James when he wasn't even home? Finally, Charlotte broke the silence. You've been spending a lot of time with James lately, she said, her tone casual but with an edge that was hard to ignore. Eleanor's eyes widened slightly, and then she quickly looked down at her hands. I'm sorry if I've made you uncomfortable, she said, her voice low. That wasn't my intention. I respect your marriage. Charlotte didn't answer right away. She watched Eleanor's face, the way she avoided eye contact, the way her fingers twitched nervously. I think it's time we all had a conversation, Charlotte said quietly. And I think that conversation needs to happen sooner rather than later. Eleanor looked at Charlotte, her expression unreadable. About what? She asked, almost too innocently. About everything, Charlotte replied. The day of the earthquake arrived unexpectedly, shaking the very foundation of everything Charlotte had come to believe. It was early morning when the tremors began, subtle at first, just a ripple beneath the surface. But within moments, the shaking intensified, throwing Charlotte from her sleep and sending her heart racing in panic. The house groaned as it moved, walls creaking under the pressure. Pippa screamed from the top of the stairs, and Charlotte rushed to her, her heart hammering in her chest. She found Pippa standing frozen in the hallway, eyes wide with terror. Mom! Pippa cried, her voice shaking as the quake rattled the house. What's happening? Charlotte grabbed her daughter and pulled her to the doorframe, the safest place she knew. It's just an earthquake, sweetheart. Stay close to me. The tremors seemed to go on forever, though it was only a matter of seconds. But in those moments, as the world around them shook violently, Charlotte's thoughts were a whirlpool of fear and disbelief. Her eyes flicked to the doorway, hoping to see James there, hoping for the comfort of his presence. But he wasn't there. It felt as though the universe was trying to pull everything apart, and Charlotte was helpless to stop it. The sounds of the quake, the thundering of the walls, the screeching of furniture as it moved, all of it seemed to echo a terrible truth that Charlotte had been avoiding for weeks. In the midst of the chaos, the front door burst open, and there stood James, breathless and wide-eyed. But it wasn't just him. Eleanor was right behind him, her face pale and her expression unreadable. They both stood there in the doorway, looking as though they had just run from the epicenter. Charlotte's gaze shifted from James to Eleanor, and in that instant, everything became painfully clear. The closeness that had been building between them, the stolen moments, the whispered conversations, they had all led to this moment. Eleanor had not just been looking for academic guidance. She had been looking for something more. And James had been more than willing to give it to her. The earthquake didn't just shake the house. It shook Charlotte to her core. Her worst fears had come to life in front of her, and she stood there, frozen in place, unable to look away. Are you all right? James asked, his voice low as he stepped forward, his hand reaching out to touch her arm. Charlotte flinched at his touch, her pulse quickening. The distance between them had grown so wide, she wasn't sure they could ever bridge it again. She looked at Eleanor, standing just behind James, her eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and something else Charlotte couldn't name. I'm fine, Charlotte managed, her voice distant, as though it wasn't really hers. But I think it's time we all had a very real conversation. James's hand dropped from her arm, and he looked at her, a flash of uncertainty crossing his face. But Charlotte didn't care anymore. The truth was out in the open now, undeniable, just like the earthquake that had shattered their world. We'll talk later, he said, his voice edged with frustration. We need to focus on getting out of here safely. But Charlotte didn't move. Her eyes were locked on Eleanor, and she could feel the weight of everything that had been building between them. This was no longer just about an affair or betrayal. It was about everything that had been left unsaid, everything that had been ignored until it could no longer be ignored. I don't think there's much to talk about anymore, Charlotte said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. It's all out in the open now. James glanced between her and Eleanor, the silence between them heavy with unspoken truths. He opened his mouth to speak, but Charlotte cut him off. No more lies, she said quietly, but firmly. No more pretending that everything is fine when it's not. The room fell silent, the earthquake still rumbling in the background as Charlotte stood there, facing the inevitable. Whatever came next, she knew it would change everything. The quake subsided, leaving behind a world that was forever altered. The tremors had stopped, but the damage to Charlotte's heart was irreversible. The house stood, but the foundation of her marriage had crumbled. She could no longer pretend that things were fine, that the family she once knew still existed. James had insisted they move quickly, find a safer place outside, away from the damaged buildings. But Charlotte had been frozen, unable to move. Her body felt heavy, weighed down by the reality that had hit her like the earthquake itself. She had spent years trying to keep everything together, her marriage, her family, her life. But now, standing in the ruins of her once stable world, she knew she had to let go. Pippa was silent in the corner, clutching her favorite toy, her wide eyes reflecting the confusion and fear that Charlotte couldn't shield her from anymore. The innocence of a child was quickly disappearing, and the weight of the world was beginning to settle in her young heart. Charlotte's heart ached for her. James paced nervously near the door, glancing out at the street where the aftermath of the earthquake was already visible. He seemed detached, distant. He wasn't the man Charlotte had married. He wasn't the man who used to hold her close in the quiet of their home. Now, he was a stranger, someone who stood beside her, but not with her. Eleanor remained by the door, looking unsure of her place. She had been part of their family, and now, her presence felt like an accusation. Charlotte didn't want to confront her yet. Not now. There was no time for that. Charlotte, James said, his voice a little strained. We need to leave. The aftershocks could come, and it's safer outside. But Charlotte didn't respond. She couldn't bring herself to care about the aftershocks when the emotional tremors were still ripping through her. Instead, she turned toward Pippa, who was still standing quietly, eyes wide with confusion. Pippa, Charlotte said softly, kneeling down to her level. Come here, sweetheart. Pippa moved to her mother, her small arms wrapping around Charlotte's waist. Charlotte's heart broke as she held her daughter close. This wasn't the life she had promised her, this wasn't the future she had imagined. But there was no going back. The earthquake had changed everything, and it wasn't just the earth beneath their feet that had cracked. It was their lives, shattered by the weight of truths that could no longer be ignored. We'll be okay, Charlotte whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was speaking to Pippa or to herself. We'll get through this. James looked at her, his eyes filled with guilt, but he didn't say anything. Eleanor, too, remained silent, as though waiting for Charlotte to make the next move. But Charlotte had already made her decision. She stood up, taking Pippa's hand in hers, and began to walk toward the door. The air outside was heavy, thick with the dust from the rubble and the smell of destruction. But Charlotte didn't feel the weight of the world on her shoulders anymore. She had carried it for too long. Now, it was time to let it go. As they stepped into the street, Charlotte looked at the horizon. The world was still reeling from the disaster, but there was something freeing about it. For the first time in a long while, she could breathe, knowing that the chaos of the quake had forced her to face the truth. She didn't know what would happen next, or how everything would turn out, but she was no longer afraid. James and Eleanor stood in the background, their figures blurred in the periphery of Charlotte's mind. She wasn't concerned with them anymore. What mattered now was Pippa, her daughter, the only thing in her life that remained pure, untainted by the cracks in the earth beneath them. And as they walked through the debris, hand in hand, Charlotte couldn't help but feel a small sense of peace. The earthquake had shattered everything, but it had also given her the chance to rebuild, to start anew. And this time, she would do it on her own terms.